Admiral James Hartwell had access to the best doctors in Texas, but none of them could explain why his 26-year-old daughter Lucy was dying right in front of them. Test after test came back normal, yet she was wasting away. Then a new night shift nurse named Rosa noticed something the specialists missed: a bitter smell, a suspicious click, and one familiar face that appeared just before Lucy's vitals would crash. When Rosa set up a hidden camera, the footage revealed a betrayal so intimate, so calculated, that even the Admiral, a man trained to spot enemies, never saw it coming. The person poisoning Lucy had been in their home for years. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Enjoy the story. Rosa Delgado's hands were shaking as she stood in the darkened stairwell of Clearwater Memorial Hospital, her flashlight beam cutting through the shadows like a knife. Outside, the thunderstorm that had knocked out half the hospital's camera system raged on, each crack of lightning illuminating the narrow corridor in brief, electric flashes. She could hear footsteps above her, moving fast, purposeful, and her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought whoever it was might hear it echoing off the concrete walls. She pressed herself against the cold metal railing, trying to steady her breathing, trying to think. This was insane. She was a 28-year-old nurse who'd been working at this hospital for exactly 6 months. She had student loans she could barely afford and a dream of advanced critical care training that seemed further away every day she showed up for the graveyard shift. She wasn't a detective. She wasn't a hero. And yet here she was, following a sound, a smell, a pattern that every instinct in her body screamed was wrong. The footsteps stopped. Rosa froze, her breath catching in her throat. Had they heard her? Did they know she was here? She waited, counting the seconds in her head, listening past the thunder, past the rain, past the pounding of her own pulse. Then she heard it, a faint scraping sound, metal against concrete, something being moved. She crouched low and crept forward, her sneakers silent on the stairs, her flashlight held at her side, not yet aimed, not yet revealing her position. 3 steps, 5, 7, and then she saw it. Behind the maintenance cart that had been sitting in this stairwell for weeks, collecting dust, forgotten by everyone. Behind it, tucked into the shadows where no one would think to look, was a black duffel bag, partially unzipped. Rosa's hands steadied as she reached for it. This was it. This was what her gut had been telling her to find. She pulled the bag toward her, the zipper hissing as she opened it wider, and shined her light inside. Nutritional packets. Dozens of them. But these weren't the standard hospital-issue supplements she saw every shift. These had been opened, resealed, tampered with. Small vials sat nestled between them, clear liquid inside, unmarked, unlabeled. Syringes, measuring spoons, and a small notebook, pages filled with dates, times, dosages, all written in a handwriting she recognized immediately because she'd seen it on visitors' logs, on get-well cards, on the daily schedule posted in Lucy Hartwell's hospital room. Her stomach turned. What she found in that stairwell, hidden behind a maintenance cart while a storm tore through the Texas night, would break a father's heart and expose a truth that had been hiding in plain sight for 6 months. A truth so intimate, so unthinkable, that even Admiral James Hartwell, a man trained to spot enemies across oceans, had never seen it coming. Rosa pulled out her phone with trembling fingers and hit record. Because 20 feet above her, the footsteps were coming back. If you believe nurses deserve more respect for catching what others miss, drop a comment saying, "Thank you, Rosa." Let's show appreciation for the real heroes. But to understand how Rosa Delgado ended up in that stairwell, clutching evidence that would destroy a family's trust, we need to go back 6 months to when this nightmare first began in the sun-drenched suburbs of Clearwater, Texas. Admiral James Hartwell was the kind of man who commanded respect the moment he walked into a room. Decorated, disciplined, a career Navy officer who'd spent 30 years serving his country with unwavering precision. His home reflected that same order: polished hardwood floors, perfectly aligned family photographs on the mantel, and a display case filled with medals and commendations that chronicled a life of duty and honor. But if you looked closely at the Admiral during those early spring evenings, past the ramrod posture and the carefully pressed shirts, you'd see something that no amount of military training could hide. Terror. Pure, helpless terror in his eyes every time he looked at his daughter. Lucy Hartwell had always been vibrant. The photographs on the walls proved it. Lucy at her college graduation, arms thrown wide, laughing. Lucy hiking in Colorado, windblown and grinning. Lucy at her 25th birthday party, surrounded by friends, her face bright with life. But the woman sitting at the family dinner table that spring was a ghost of those images. Pale, exhausted, her hand trembling slightly as she lifted her fork, managing only a few bites before pushing the plate away with an apologetic smile. The family assistant hovered nearby, concern etched across his face, always ready with Lucy's medications, her supplements, her carefully prepared meals. He'd been with the Hartwell family for 8 years, a constant presence, someone the Admiral trusted implicitly. When Lucy couldn't finish her dinner, he'd gently suggest a nutritional shake instead. When she looked too tired to climb the stairs, he was there to help. Always helpful, always concerned, always there. The Admiral made his first call to a specialist the following week. Then another, and another. He pulled every string he had, called in favors from decades of military connections, flew in the best gastroenterologists, immunologists, and diagnosticians Texas had to offer. They ran tests, blood panels, imaging scans, biopsies, each doctor more renowned than the last, each one reviewing Lucy's case with furrowed brows and expensive degrees, and each one arriving at the same maddening conclusion: all results normal. There was nothing wrong with Lucy Hartwell that modern medicine could detect, but Lucy kept getting worse. 98 pounds in April, 92 pounds in May. By early June, she dropped to 87 pounds, her clothes hanging off her frame like they belonged to someone else. The Admiral stopped going to his office. He stopped returning calls from the base. He moved into Lucy's hospital room at Clearwater Memorial, sleeping upright in the vinyl chair beside her bed, watching her chest rise and fall, terrified that each breath might be her last. The doctors kept saying the same thing. Her vitals were stable, her organs were functioning, there was no infection, no disease, no explanation. But a father knows. And Admiral James Hartwell knew his daughter was dying right in front of him, and no one could tell him why. The Admiral didn't know it yet, but the answer to his daughter's mysterious illness had been in his home the entire time, hiding behind a smile he trusted completely. Rosa Delgado wasn't supposed to be the one who solved this mystery. She was 28 years old, the first person in her family to finish college, working the graveyard shift at Clearwater Memorial because those were the only hours that paid enough to chip away at her student loans. She'd grown up in a working-class neighborhood where becoming a nurse meant you'd made it, where her mother still bragged to the neighbors about her daughter saving lives. But Rosa wanted more. She dreamed of advanced critical care training, of working in intensive units where the most complex cases came through, where her skills could make the biggest difference. The program cost $40,000. She had $300 in her savings account, so she worked nights. She took the shifts no one else wanted, and she paid attention. Rosa was the kind of nurse who carried a small spiral notebook in her scrub's pocket, the pages filled with observations that didn't fit neatly into electronic medical charts. She noticed patterns. She questioned assumptions. And she had a rule she'd learned early in nursing school. When a patient looks sick but the numbers say they're fine, trust your eyes, not the printout. Her first night assigned to Lucy Hartwell's room came in mid-June, 3 months into Lucy's unexplained decline. Rosa knocked softly before entering, introducing herself to the Admiral, who sat in his usual chair beside the bed, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. He barely looked up, just a slight nod, a murmured acknowledgement, nothing more. Rosa understood. He'd met dozens of nurses by now, dozens of doctors. All of them had promised to help, and none of them had delivered. She didn't take it personally. Instead, she turned her attention to Lucy. The young woman was sleeping, her breathing shallow but steady, her face so pale it almost disappeared into the white hospital pillow. Rosa checked her 4-line, her vitals monitor, the catheter bag, everything by the book. But Rosa had stopped trusting books 3 years into her nursing career when she'd caught a medication error that every computer system had missed. She trusted her senses instead. She leaned closer to Lucy's bedside table, where the evening hydration mix sat in its plastic bottle, half finished. Rosa unscrewed the cap and brought it to her nose. There it was. Faint, almost imperceptible, but present, a bitter smell that didn't belong in a standard nutritional supplement. She recapped the bottle and made a note in her spiral notebook. 11:15 p.m. Hydration mix. Unusual odor. At 11:47, Rosa heard it. A soft click from Lucy's door sensor. She glanced at the clock, then at the door. Visiting hours had ended at 9. The hallway should have been empty except for staff. But the sensor had registered someone entering or leaving. She made another note. Over the next week, Rosa watched. Not just Lucy's charts, not just her declining numbers, but the people around her. She noticed that Lucy's vitals would be stable all evening, but then, 15 to 20 minutes after the family assistant finished his nightly visit, her heart rate would spike. Her blood pressure would climb. Her breathing would become labored. The episodes lasted about an hour, then subsided. Every night, like clockwork, Rosa did something no other medical professional had done. She stopped looking at Lucy's charts and started watching the people around her. She didn't know it yet, but these small observations, these notes scribbled in her spiral notebook about bitter smells and door sensors and vital sign patterns, would lead her to that dark stairwell on the night of the storm, where she'd find proof that would shatter everything. Rosa knew she couldn't do this alone. On her third night with Lucy, she approached the one person in Clearwater Memorial she thought might listen without dismissing her as a paranoid night shift nurse looking for drama. Caleb Moore had been the hospital's security supervisor for 15 years. He was in his late 50s, with gray stubble and tired eyes that had seen every possible variation of human behavior within these walls. Staff fights, drug diversion, family smuggling and contraband. He'd handled it all with a quiet efficiency that earned respect without demanding it. When Rosa found him at his desk reviewing camera feeds, she expected skepticism. Instead, Caleb leaned back in his chair and listened. She showed him her notebook. The patterns, the times, the vital spikes. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled up the security footage from Lucy's floor. They watched together. Night after night, the same pattern emerged on the screen. The family assistant arriving at 11:30, entering Lucy's room, staying for 12 to 15 minutes, leaving at 11:47, every single night. Caleb rewound the footage, played it again, his jaw tightening. He'd lost his own sister 20 years ago to medical negligence, a misdiagnosis that could have been caught if anyone had bothered to look closely enough. Patient safety wasn't just protocol to Caleb. It was personal. He gave Rosa access to 2 weeks of archived footage. She took it home, watched it frame by frame on her laptop, documenting every visit, every timeline, every anomaly. But footage alone wouldn't prove anything. She needed physical evidence. The next evening, Rosa approached the hospital pharmacy with Lucy's hydration mix. She asked them to run an analysis, keeping her tone casual, professional. The pharmacist ran the standard panel and handed her the results the following morning. Within normal parameters, everything checked out. But Rosa's instincts screamed otherwise. She went back. She asked for a more detailed toxicology screen, the kind typically reserved for suspected overdose cases. The pharmacist raised an eyebrow, but agreed. 3 days later, Rosa got the call that changed everything. The detailed screen had found trace amounts of a compound that shouldn't have been there. It was sophisticated, almost elegant in its cruelty. Someone had been adding small, carefully measured doses of a substance that mimicked severe malnutrition symptoms, muscle wasting, fatigue, electrolyte imbalance, digestive shutdown. But the substance metabolized rapidly, usually within 6 to 8 hours, which explained why it never showed up in Lucy's routine blood work. The doctors had been testing her at the wrong times, always after the poison had already left her system. Whoever was doing this understood pharmacokinetics. They understood metabolism rates and detection windows. This required medical knowledge, real medical knowledge. Rosa sat in her car in the hospital parking lot, staring at the toxicology report, her hands trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. Lucy Hartwell wasn't dying from some mysterious illness. She was being poisoned, slowly, methodically, by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Rosa now knew Lucy was being poisoned. But by who? And why? The answer was about to walk through Lucy's door at exactly 11:47 p.m., just like clockwork. If you think Rosa should confront this person immediately, comment confront. If you think she should gather more evidence first, comment wait. What would you do? Rosa and Caleb sat in his cramped security office. The toxicology report spread between them like an accusation. They had proof of poisoning, but they needed a name. Caleb pulled up the visitor logs, cross-referencing them with the security footage timestamps. One name appeared with mechanical regularity, night after night, always at the same time. Marcus Brennan, the Hartwell family assistant. Rosa had seen him dozens of times during her shifts. Mid-40s, quiet, efficient. He moved through Lucy's hospital room with the familiarity of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before. He'd adjust her pillows, refill her water pitcher, chat softly with the Admiral about household matters and upcoming appointments. He was always helpful, always concerned, always there. The Admiral trusted him completely. In fact, from what Rosa had observed, the Admiral seemed to rely on Marcus for nearly everything outside of military affairs. Caleb ran Marcus's name through the hospital's background check system, the same database they used for all regular visitors to restricted floors. Former Navy medic. Honorable discharge after 12 years of service. Medical training included pharmacology, field medicine, emergency care. He would absolutely know how to poison someone in a way that avoided detection. Rosa asked Caleb to dig deeper, and what they found painted a picture that was both tragic and terrifying. Marcus had come to work for Admiral Hartwell 8 years ago, shortly after his discharge from the Navy. He'd been struggling with addiction then, his life in shambles, his future uncertain. The Admiral had taken him in, helped him get clean, gave him purpose and structure and a place to belong. Marcus had been with the family ever since. He'd been there when Lucy graduated college. There when she brought home her first boyfriend. There for every holiday, every birthday, every milestone. He wasn't just an employee. He'd become part of the fabric of their lives. He scheduled the Admiral's calendar, managed the household finances, coordinated Lucy's medical appointments, ensured the Admiral's uniforms were pressed and his meals were prepared, and his life ran with military precision. Marcus had made himself indispensable. No, more than that. He'd made himself necessary. Caleb found something else in the old visitor logs from 6 months earlier. Marcus had been at the house the day Lucy told her father about graduate school. Stanford, all the way across the country. She'd been accepted into a prestigious program, full funding, an opportunity she'd worked years to achieve. The Admiral had been thrilled for her. Proud. Already talking about visiting California, maybe even relocating after his retirement. Rosa remembered a conversation she'd overheard 2 weeks ago. Lucy, in one of her more lucid moments, talking softly to her father about her plans, her dreams, her future. And Marcus, standing in the corner of the room, his face carefully neutral, his hands gripping the meal tray just a little too tightly. It clicked into place with horrifying clarity. If Lucy left, the Admiral would follow. He'd downsize the house, maybe sell it entirely. He wouldn't need someone to manage a household that no longer existed. Marcus would lose his job, his home, his purpose. The family that had saved him would move on, and he'd be left behind, alone, unnecessary. Everything he'd built his identity around for 8 years would disappear. Marcus didn't want to hurt Lucy. He just needed her to stay sick enough that the Admiral would never leave. He needed to be needed. And he was willing to slowly kill her to make that happen. Understanding motive wasn't enough. Rosa and Caleb needed proof that would hold up beyond their suspicions, beyond patterns in notebooks and theories about psychology. They needed to catch Marcus in the act. The plan they devised was simple but risky. Caleb would requisition a small discreet camera from the security equipment storage, the kind used for monitoring sensitive areas. Rosa would place a fresh nutritional bottle in Lucy's room, positioned exactly where Marcus always found it, on the small table beside her stand. Then they would wait. The camera went in during Rosa's afternoon shift, tucked behind a flower arrangement that had been sitting on the windowsill for weeks, its lens no bigger than a shirt button, aimed directly at Lucy's bedside table and 4-line. Rosa's hands shook as she adjusted the angle. If Marcus noticed it, if he suspected anything, he'd disappear. Worse, he might accelerate whatever he was doing to Lucy. But if they did nothing, Lucy would continue wasting away while her father watched helplessly, never knowing the truth was standing right beside him. The night of the trap, Rosa couldn't eat. She arrived for her shift 2 hours early, checking and rechecking the camera feed on Caleb's monitor in the security office. The lens was working. The angle was perfect. Everything was in place. But Rosa's mind raced with doubts. What if Marcus didn't come tonight? What if he'd somehow sensed their suspicion and changed his pattern? What if the camera malfunctioned? And beneath all those fears was something heavier, something that made her stomach twist. If Marcus did take the bait, if they caught him on camera, they were about to shatter Admiral Hartwell's world. They were about to prove that the man he'd saved, the man he'd trusted for 8 years, had been slowly murdering his daughter. At 9:30 p.m., the first rumble of thunder echoed across Clearwater. By 10 p.m., rain was hammering against the hospital windows, and lightning split the sky in jagged white cracks. At 10:43, the lights flickered. Caleb's radio crackled with reports from maintenance. The storm had knocked out part of the hospital's backup camera system on the east wing. Not Lucy's floor, thank God, but close enough to send a chill down Rosa's spine. The storm felt like an omen. She sat at the nurse's station, pretending to review charts, her eyes flicking to the clock every 30 seconds. 11:30. Marcus would arrive any minute now. 11:35. 11:40. Her heart was hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. Caleb's voice came through her phone, low and steady. "Camera's live. I've got eyes on the room." At exactly 11:47 p.m., Marcus Brennan walked through Lucy's door. Rosa watched him on Caleb's monitor, her breath caught in her throat. He moved with the same quiet efficiency he always did, checking Lucy's sleeping form, adjusting her blanket with what looked like genuine tenderness. The camera was rolling. Marcus was in the room, and what he did next would be captured in excruciating, undeniable detail. If you can't stand people who abuse trust like this, hit that subscribe button. Every subscription is a vote against betrayal. Rosa watched the monitor in Caleb's office, her entire body rigid, as Marcus moved through Lucy's room with practiced ease. He approached the bed, leaning down close to Lucy's sleeping face. His lips moved. He was saying something to her, words too soft for the camera to catch, but his expression was gentle, almost paternal. He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. To anyone watching, it would look like compassion, like care. Then Marcus straightened and turned to the bedside table. His hand slipped into his jacket pocket and emerged with a small glass vial, no bigger than his thumb. The liquid inside was clear, innocuous, identical to 1,000 other medical compounds that move through hospital corridors every day. He unscrewed the cap from Lucy's hydration bottle with steady fingers. No hesitation, no tremor of guilt. He tilted the vial and let exactly 4 drops fall into the nutritional mix. 4 drops. Measured. Precise. He recapped both containers, gave the bottle a gentle swirl to mix the contents, then set it back exactly where it had been. But he wasn't finished. Marcus moved to Lucy's forestand, his eyes scanning the pump that regulated the flow of fluids into her bloodstream. He pressed 2 buttons, adjusting the drip rate. The change was subtle, barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for, but Rosa recognized it immediately. He'd increased the rate just enough to deliver the poisoned hydration mix faster, ensuring it would reach Lucy's system before his compound metabolized. It was calculated, clinical, the work of someone who understood exactly what he was doing. Marcus checked Lucy's vitals on the monitor one last time, watching the numbers with the focus of a medical professional assessing his patient. Satisfied, he turned and walked toward the door. As he pulled it closed behind him, Rosa heard it through the monitor's audio feed. That distinctive click of the door sensor. 11:47 p.m. Just like clockwork. The security office fell into suffocating silence. Rosa and Caleb sat frozen, staring at the screen where Marcus had just committed attempted murder in high definition. Rosa's hands were shaking uncontrollably now, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She'd suspected. She'd theorized. But watching it happen, seeing the deliberate poisoning of a dying woman by someone who was supposed to protect her, made bile rise in her throat. Caleb reached for his phone, his weathered face harder than Rosa had ever seen it. He dialed the police, his voice steady and professional as he reported what they'd witnessed, requesting officers be dispatched to Clearwater Memorial immediately. Rosa stood abruptly. She couldn't breathe in this small office. She couldn't think. She mumbled something to Caleb about needing air and stumbled out into the hallway. The stairwell. She needed the stairwell where it was quiet and cool and she could process what she'd just seen without the fluorescent lights and the beeping monitors and the suffocating weight of knowing. She pushed through the heavy door and leaned against the concrete wall, her head spinning, her stomach churning. That's when she heard them. Footsteps, descending from the floor above. Quick, purposeful footsteps that she'd heard on camera 1,000 times in the security footage. Marcus was coming back. He'd forgotten something. Rosa was alone in the stairwell. Marcus was 20 feet away, and he had no idea he'd just been caught on camera. Rosa's heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed herself into the shadows of the stairwell, her mind racing through impossible options. She could run back up to the nurse's station, but Marcus would see her. She could call out for help, but who would hear her over the storm? Then her eyes caught on something she'd missed in her panic. The maintenance cart. The same dust-covered cart that had been sitting in this stairwell for weeks, forgotten by housekeeping, ignored by everyone who passed it. She pulled out her phone, turned on the flashlight, and crouched low. Behind the cart, exactly where she'd found it in those frantic moments that opened this story, was a black duffel bag. Her hands moved on instinct, unzipping it, her phone's camera recording everything as she cataloged what was inside. Altered nutritional packets, dozens of them, their seals carefully broken and resealed. Small glass vials filled with clear liquid, unlabeled, anonymous. Syringes still in their sterile packaging. Measuring spoons. And that notebook, pages dense with Marcus's handwriting. Dates, times, dosages. A meticulous record of every time he'd poisoned Lucy Hartwell over the past 6 months. The footsteps stopped. Rosa looked up from the bag, her phone's light still recording, and there he was. Marcus Brennan stood at the landing above her, frozen mid-step, his eyes locked on Rosa, then on the open duffel bag, then back to Rosa. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The only sound was rain battering the windows and Rosa's ragged breathing. She waited for him to run. Waited for him to lunge for the bag, to grab her phone, to do something violent and desperate. Instead, Marcus's face simply crumbled. It wasn't the expression of someone caught in a crime. It was the expression of someone whose entire world had just collapsed. His shoulders sagged. His eyes filled with tears. He sank down onto the step, his back against the wall, and covered his face with his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, broken and hollow. "I couldn't lose him," Marcus said, and the words came out like a confession he'd been holding back for months. "The Admiral is all I have." Rosa stayed crouched by the bag, her phone still recording, her voice trapped in her throat. She wanted to scream at him, wanted to ask him how he could justify slowly killing an innocent woman. But before she could find words, she heard new sounds echoing up from the ground floor. Heavy boots, radio static, voices calling out directions. Caleb had called the police. 2 officers appeared in the stairwell within minutes, followed by Caleb himself, his face grim. Marcus didn't resist. He stood when they asked him to, extended his hands for the cuffs without protest, his eyes still wet with tears. As they led him down the stairs, he looked back at Rosa one last time. Not with anger, not with hatred, with something worse. Regret. The kind of regret that comes when you realize you've destroyed everything, including yourself, and there's no way back. It was just before dawn when they woke Admiral James Hartwell. Rosa stood outside Lucy's room, watching through the window as Caleb and a hospital administrator broke the news. She saw the Admiral's face go through a progression of emotions so rapid they blurred together. Confusion, disbelief, denial, and then, finally, a terrible, crushing understanding. His most trusted friend, the man he'd saved from addiction, the man he'd welcomed into his home and his life, had been poisoning his daughter for 6 months. The Admiral didn't cry. Men like him don't. But Rosa saw something die behind his eyes, a kind of trust that, once broken, can never be repaired. The human body has a remarkable capacity for healing when you stop poisoning it. Within 48 hours of Marcus's arrest, Lucy Hartwell's vitals began to stabilize in ways they hadn't in half a year. The unexplained spikes stopped. The mysterious crashes in blood pressure ceased. Her heart rate settled into a steady, healthy rhythm that the nurses had almost forgotten was possible for her. But the real changes took longer, unfolding in small, precious increments that Rosa documented in her notebook with the same meticulous attention she'd given to the signs of Lucy's decline. The first week, Lucy's appetite returned. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in quiet moments that felt like miracles to anyone who'd watched her push away meal after meal for months. She asked for toast one morning, then soup. Then, a few days later, she ate an entire breakfast and asked for seconds. The nutritionist adjusted her meal plan carefully, not wanting to overwhelm her recovering digestive system. But Lucy's body seemed hungry to repair itself, eager to reclaim what had been stolen from it drop by poison drop. Her color came back next. The grayish pallor that had made her look like a fading photograph began to warm. Pink returned to her cheeks. Her lips lost that bluish tinge that had terrified her father every time he looked at her. The nurses started commenting on it during shift changes, small observations that carried enormous weight. She looks better today. Did you see her smile? Her eyes are brighter. By the end of the 3rd week, Lucy had gained 12 pounds. 12 pounds that represented countless small victories. 12 pounds that meant her body was absorbing nutrients instead of being sabotaged by them. 12 pounds that transformed her from a woman who looked like she was disappearing into someone who looked like she might actually have a future. The doctors who'd spent months baffled by her mysterious decline were now baffled by her rapid recovery, though they tried to hide it behind professional terminology about the body's resilience and the unpredictability of whatever unnamed condition they'd failed to diagnose. Only a handful of people knew the truth. The police had requested discretion during their investigation. Marcus had been arrested quietly, removed from the hospital before dawn, charged with attempted murder, and held without bail. The Admiral had agreed to keep the details private until the case went to trial, not out of any desire to protect Marcus, but to protect Lucy from becoming a media spectacle, from having her near-death experience turned into headlines and speculation. Through all of it, Admiral James Hartwell barely left his daughter's side. But he was different now. The rigid military bearing that had defined him for 3 decades had softened into something more human, more vulnerable. He no longer sat ramrod straight in the hospital chair, reviewing reports and barking orders into his phone. Instead, he slouched slightly, his hand often resting on Lucy's bed rail, his eyes tracking her every movement with a mixture of relief and lingering terror that she might somehow slip away again. He started talking to the nurses, not just functional exchanges about medication schedules and test results, but actual conversations. He learned their names, asked about their families, thanked them for things he'd previously taken for granted. When the night shift arrived, he'd nod respectfully to each nurse, acknowledging their presence in a way that Rosa recognized as his version of an apology for the months he'd barely seen them as people. And he asked for Rosa specifically. Every shift she worked, the Admiral would seek her out, requesting that she update him personally on Lucy's progress. Not because he didn't trust the other nurses, but because Rosa had seen what no one else had seen. She'd trusted her instincts when 50 doctors had trusted their tests. She'd cared enough to look beyond the charts, beyond the normal parameters, beyond the reassurances that everything was fine when clearly nothing was fine. The conversations were brief at first, almost formal. Rosa would report Lucy's vitals, her food intake, her sleep patterns. The Admiral would nod, ask a clarifying question or two, thank her. But gradually, the exchanges became something more. He started asking Rosa about her own life, where she'd gone to school, why she'd become a nurse, what her goals were. When Rosa mentioned, almost embarrassed, that she dreamed of advanced critical care training but couldn't afford the program, the Admiral simply nodded, his expression unreadable, and said nothing more about it. But Rosa noticed him making a note in the small leather journal he'd started carrying. Lucy's cognitive recovery mirrored her physical one. The fog that had settled over her mind during the worst of the poisoning began to lift. She started reading again, holding books without her hands trembling, making it through entire chapters without falling asleep mid-page. She asked questions about what had happened to her, and the Admiral, after consulting with her medical team, decided she deserved the truth. He told her everything. About Marcus, about the poisoning, about Rosa. It was a Tuesday morning, 3.5 weeks after Marcus's arrest, when Lucy asked to see Rosa. The request came through the charge nurse, who found Rosa in the break room reviewing charts. Lucy Hartwell is asking for you specifically, the charge nurse said, and something in her tone suggested this wasn't just a routine patient request. Rosa walked to Lucy's room with her heart beating faster than it should have been. She'd checked on Lucy dozens of times since that night in the stairwell, but always as her nurse, always in a professional capacity. This felt different. Lucy was sitting up in bed when Rosa entered, propped against pillows, wearing her own pajamas now instead of a hospital gown. Her hair had been washed and brushed. She looked like a person again instead of a patient. "Rosa," Lucy said, and her voice was stronger than Rosa had ever heard it. "Can you sit with me for a minute?" Rosa pulled a chair close to the bed, and Lucy reached out and took her hand. Her grip was still weak, but it was there, present, alive. Lucy's eyes, clear and focused in a way they hadn't been in months, searched Rosa's face. "They told me what happened," Lucy said quietly. "They told me what Marcus did. And they told me that you were the one who figured it out. That 50 doctors examined me, ran every test imaginable, and couldn't find anything wrong. But you did. You found what they all missed." Rosa started to deflect, to say she'd just been doing her job, but Lucy squeezed her hand gently, stopping her. "No," Lucy said. "It wasn't just your job. You cared enough to look. You paid attention when it would have been easier to trust what everyone else was saying. You put your career at risk by insisting something was wrong when all the experts said everything was normal. You saved my life, Rosa. Not because you're the smartest or the most experienced, but because you refused to look away." Rosa felt tears burning in her eyes. She'd spent the past 3 weeks focused on Lucy's recovery, on making sure Marcus's arrest stuck, on documenting everything for the police investigation. She hadn't allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened, of how close they'd come to losing Lucy completely. Now, sitting in this hospital room with Lucy's hand in hers, the emotion crashed over her like a wave. "I'm just glad you're getting better," Rosa managed to say, her voice thick. Lucy smiled, and it was the first real smile Rosa had seen from her. "My dad wants to talk to you," Lucy said. "He's been planning something. He won't tell me what, but he keeps asking me questions about you, about what you like, what matters to you. I think you should prepare yourself for Admiral James Hartwell in full gratitude mode. It's probably going to be overwhelming." Rosa laughed despite herself, wiping at her eyes. "He's already been incredibly kind. He barely acknowledged you the first night you worked with me," Lucy said gently. "I remember. I was half asleep, but I remember him sitting there like a stone, like he'd given up on everyone. And now he asks about you every single day. That's not kindness, Rosa. That's respect. From a man who doesn't give it easily." They sat together for a few more minutes, Lucy telling Rosa about the books she was reading, about the physical therapy she'd start next week, about the graduate school program that had agreed to defer her admission for a year while she recovered. She talked about the future in a way that would have been impossible a month ago, when the future had been measured in days, maybe hours. When Rosa finally stood to leave, to check on her other patients, Lucy stopped her one more time. "Rosa," she said, "thank you for seeing me when I was invisible, for believing something was wrong when everyone said I was fine, for being the kind of nurse who actually cares. The world needs more people like you." Rosa stepped into the hallway and had to lean against the wall for a moment, overwhelmed. She remembered her first night with Lucy so clearly. The Admiral who wouldn't meet her eyes, who'd lost faith in everyone who walked through that door. She remembered feeling invisible, just another nurse in an endless rotation of medical professionals who'd all failed to help his dying daughter. Now he was asking her to save the date. He had something important to give her. Lucy had warned her, had told her to prepare herself. But Rosa had no idea what Admiral James Hartwell could possibly want to give her beyond his thanks, which he'd already expressed more times than necessary. She was a night shift nurse with student debt and secondhand scrubs, and a dream that seemed perpetually out of reach. What Rosa didn't know yet, what she couldn't have imagined as she walked back to the nurse's station to document Lucy's continued improvement, was that the Admiral had spent the past 3 weeks making phone calls, calling in the last of his favors, reaching out to colleagues and connections built over 30 years of military service. He'd made a decision the night Rosa had saved his daughter's life, and now he was going to make sure that decision changed Rosa's life the way she'd changed Lucy's. He was going to give Rosa her dream, and he wasn't going to take no for an answer. The message came through Rosa's phone 3 days after her conversation with Lucy. A text from an unknown number that identified itself as Admiral Hartwell. Simple, direct, military precision even in a text message. "Miss Delgado, would you meet me on the hospital rooftop tomorrow at 2 p.m.? I have something to discuss with you. James Hartwell." Rosa read the message 4 times, her stomach fluttering with nerves she couldn't quite name. She texted back a simple, "Yes, sir," then spent the next 24 hours trying not to obsess over what the Admiral could possibly want to discuss that required privacy, that required the rooftop instead of Lucy's hospital room, or the hallway, or any of the dozens of places they'd spoken before. The rooftop of Clearwater Memorial wasn't technically open to visitors. It was a maintenance access area, home to HVAC units and electrical equipment, surrounded by a chain-link fence that was supposed to keep people out. But the hospital staff had been using it as an unofficial break area for years, a place to escape the fluorescent lights and recycled air, to see the sky and remember there was a world beyond these walls. Rosa had been up there a handful of times during particularly stressful shifts, sitting on an overturned bucket, letting the Texas wind clear her head. She arrived 5 minutes early, pushing through the heavy metal door that led to the roof, and found Admiral James Hartwell already there. He stood near the edge, looking out over Clearwater, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture so ingrained it was probably unconscious. He'd changed since that first night Rosa had met him. The rigid military bearing was still there, but softened somehow, made more human by everything he'd endured. He wore civilian clothes, jeans, and a simple button-down shirt, and Rosa realized she'd never seen him in anything but his uniform or the rumpled clothes of a man who'd been sleeping in a hospital chair for months. "Miss Delgado," he said, turning when he heard her footsteps. "Thank you for coming." "Of course," Rosa said, suddenly aware of how informal she must look in her scrubs, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her shoes scuffed from 12-hour shifts. She felt like she should stand at attention or salute or something. But the Admiral gestured to a bench someone had dragged up here years ago, its paint peeling but still sturdy. They sat together, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the city drifted up to them. Traffic on the highway. A distant siren. The wind rustling through the live oaks that surrounded the hospital. It was peaceful in a way that hospital interiors never were, and Rosa understood why the Admiral had chosen this place for whatever conversation he needed to have. "I've spent 30 years in the Navy," the Admiral finally said, his eyes still on the horizon. "I've commanded ships, led operations, made decisions that affected hundreds of lives. I've been decorated for service and leadership. And yet, 3 weeks ago, I was completely helpless. I watched my daughter dying, and despite every resource at my disposal, despite calling in every favor I'd accumulated over 3 decades, I couldn't save her." He turned to look at Rosa directly, and she saw something in his expression that took her breath away. Humility. Raw, unguarded humility from a man who'd built a career on strength and certainty. "You're a 28-year-old night shift nurse," he continued, "working a job that probably doesn't pay you what you're worth, buried in student debt, overlooked by almost everyone who walks through that hospital. And you saved my daughter's life. Not because you had more resources or more authority or more experience than the specialists I flew in from across the country. You saved her because you paid attention, because you refused to accept normal when your patient was clearly suffering. Because you were willing to trust your instincts even when it meant questioning people far more credentialed than yourself." Rosa felt her throat tighten. She wanted to say something humble, something deflecting, but the Admiral held up a hand gently. "I failed Lucy," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on his daughter's name. "I failed her by trusting the wrong person, by being so focused on the medical mystery that I never considered the human element. By putting my faith in Marcus without question, without ever stopping to look closely at the person I'd invited into our lives. You succeeded where I failed, and where 50 doctors failed, because you did the hardest thing in the world. You looked." He reached beside him and picked up a leather folder that Rosa hadn't noticed before. It was professional, expensive-looking, the kind of portfolio used for important documents. The Admiral held it in his lap for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts, then extended it toward Rosa. "I asked you up here because I have something for you," he said, "and I need you to hear what I'm about to say before you try to refuse it." Rosa took the folder with trembling hands. The leather was smooth and cool under her fingers. She looked at the Admiral, who nodded once, giving her permission to open it. Inside were documents. Official documents with letterhead from the Texas Advanced Critical Care Institute, one of the most prestigious nursing programs in the country. Rosa had researched it obsessively 2 years ago, had even started an application before she'd seen the cost, and realized it was impossible. $40,000 for the 18-month program. No financial aid available. Payment plans that still required more money up front than she'd make in a year of night shifts. She stared at the top document, her eyes struggling to make sense of what she was reading. It was a letter of acceptance, addressed to her, dated 3 days ago. She flipped to the next page. A full scholarship award. Tuition, fees, books, even a stipend for living expenses. Everything. Completely covered. Her hands started shaking so badly, she almost dropped the folder. I don't understand, she whispered. The program director is a colleague, the Admiral said quietly. We served together years ago. When I told him what you did for Lucy, when I explained your situation, he reviewed your original application. You were qualified 2 years ago, Rosa. You were more than qualified. You just couldn't afford it. Rosa stared at the documents, reading the same lines over and over, trying to make her brain accept what her eyes were seeing. Full scholarship. All expenses covered. Start date in 6 weeks. Transfer approval from Clearwater Memorial already processed. Everything arranged. Everything handled. Everything impossible suddenly made possible. I can't accept this, she said, even as every cell in her body screamed that she wanted to, that she needed to, that this was the dream she'd carried for years. This is too much. It's too generous. I just did my job. You saved my daughter's life, the Admiral interrupted, and his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. My daughter, who is everything to me. Who is my legacy and my joy and the best thing I've ever done in this world. You gave her back to me when I thought I'd lost her forever. There is no amount of money, no gesture, no gift that could ever equal what you did for my family. Rosa felt tears streaming down her face now, hot and unstoppable. She tried to wipe them away, but they kept coming. Let me invest in yours, the Admiral said, leaning forward slightly. You invested everything you had into saving Lucy. Your time, your instincts, your courage, your career security. You risked being wrong, being fired, being labeled a troublemaker or a paranoid nurse who couldn't accept medical expertise. You put yourself on the line for someone you barely knew because it was the right thing to do. Now let me do the right thing for you. But the cost, Rosa managed to say, $40,000, plus living expenses, plus, is money I can afford to spend, the Admiral said firmly. And more importantly, it's money that will be invested in someone who will use this training to save other lives. You saw what 50 doctors missed because you were willing to trust what you observed over what you were told. That's not just good nursing, Rosa. That's exceptional nursing. That's the kind of clinical judgment that can't be taught in a textbook, but it can be refined and developed and given the tools and knowledge it needs to reach its full potential. He paused, his eyes intense and unwavering. You're the kind of nurse who saves lives, he said. Not because you have the most advanced degree or the most years of experience, but because you care enough to look beyond the obvious. Don't let money stop you from becoming everything you're capable of being. Don't let student debt and night shifts and financial barriers keep you from developing gifts that could save dozens, maybe hundreds of other patients in situations just like Lucy's. Rosa couldn't speak. She could barely breathe. She clutched the folder to her chest like it might disappear if she let go, her mind reeling through everything this meant. The Advanced Critical Care Institute. The program she'd dreamed about. The training that would open doors she'd never thought she could walk through. The opportunity to work in intensive care units, to handle the most complex patients, to be the kind of nurse who made a real difference in life and death situations. I've already spoken to your nursing supervisor, the Admiral continued, his tone gentling. She's agreed to hold your position here if you want to return after the program. But honestly, Rosa, after you complete this training, you'll have offers from hospitals across the country. You'll be able to write your own ticket, work wherever you want, specialize in whatever area calls to you. The program has a 98% job placement rate, and their graduates are some of the most sought-after critical care nurses in the profession. He reached over and put his hand on hers, a gesture so paternal it made Rosa's heart ache. I'm a father who almost lost his daughter, he said softly. I know what that feels like now. I know the terror, the helplessness, the desperate hope that someone, somewhere will see what everyone else is missing. You were that someone for Lucy. For me. Let me help you become that someone for other families, other patients, other people who need a nurse with your gifts and your courage. Rosa looked down at the folder, then up at the Admiral's weathered face, and she saw something there that made her decision. She saw a man who'd been broken and put back together differently. A man who'd learned humility through nearly losing what mattered most. A man who understood that the greatest gift you can give someone isn't gratitude or money, but opportunity. Okay, she whispered. Okay, I'll do it. Thank you. Thank you so much. The Admiral smiled, and it transformed his entire face. No, he said. Thank you for seeing my daughter, for refusing to give up when everyone else had accepted the impossible, for being the kind of person who does the right thing even when it's hard, even when it's risky, even when no one would have blamed you for staying quiet and safe. They sat together on that rooftop for another 20 minutes, talking about the program, about logistics, about what Rosa would need to do to prepare. The Admiral had thought of everything. He'd arranged temporary housing near the Institute. He'd set up a bank account in her name with funds for expenses. He'd even contacted the program director to ensure Rosa would have access to mentorship and additional support if she needed it. It was overwhelming and beautiful and terrifying and perfect all at once. Rosa kept waiting to wake up, to discover this was some elaborate dream conjured by exhaustion and wishful thinking. But the folder remained solid in her hands. The documents remained real. And the Admiral remained beside her, mapping out a future she'd never dared to believe she could actually have. When they finally stood to leave, to return to the hospital below where Lucy was probably wondering where her father had disappeared to, the Admiral stopped Rosa with a hand on her shoulder. One more thing, he said. This doesn't end with the scholarship. When you finish the program, when you're working as a critical care nurse somewhere, I want you to remember something. You'll encounter other nurses like you were a month ago. Brilliant, capable, overlooked nurses who can't afford advanced training, who have the gifts but not the resources. When you meet them, I want you to tell them about this, about how one act of courage and compassion opened doors you never thought you could walk through. And if you ever want to help one of them the way I helped you, you call me. We'll make it happen. Rosa could only nod, too overwhelmed for words. The Admiral had just given her more than a scholarship. He'd given her a mission, a legacy, a way to pay forward what had been given to her, to create a ripple effect that would spread far beyond this rooftop, beyond this hospital, beyond this moment. As they walked back toward the door, back toward the fluorescent-lit corridors and beeping monitors and the everyday reality of hospital life, Rosa felt something shift inside her. She'd walked onto this rooftop as a night shift nurse with student debt and impossible dreams. She was walking off it as someone with a future, with opportunity, with the chance to become everything she'd always hoped she could be. And it had all started because she'd refused to look away, because she'd trusted her instincts over the experts, because she'd cared enough about a dying patient to question everything, to risk everything, to pursue the truth even when it led her into dark stairwells and dangerous confrontations. If you believe in people who stand up and do the right thing, even when it's hard, comment, I stand for justice. Let's flood this comment section with support for heroes like Rosa. 2 months after that conversation on the rooftop, Lucy Hartwell was finally going home. Her discharge day arrived on a bright September morning, the kind of Texas day where the heat had started to break and the sky stretched endless and blue above clear water. Rosa had switched shifts specifically to be there, to see Lucy walk out of the hospital that had been her prison for so many months. Lucy stood in her room, dressed in real clothes for the first time in what felt like forever. Jeans that actually fit her now healthy frame. A soft blue sweater. Sneakers instead of hospital socks. Her hair, which had been thin and lifeless during the worst of the poisoning, had started to grow back fuller, shinier. She looked like the young woman in those photographs on the Hartwell family mantle. Vibrant, alive, full of future. The discharge process took longer than it should have. Nurses kept stopping by to say goodbye, to hug Lucy, to tell her how happy they were to see her leaving on her own feet instead of the way they'd all secretly feared she might leave. The day shift supervisor brought flowers. The physical therapist who'd worked with Lucy during her recovery brought a card signed by the entire PT department. Even the hospital chaplain, who'd sat with the Admiral during some of his darkest nights, stopped in to offer a blessing for Lucy's continued health. Through it all, Admiral Hartwell stood quietly to the side, letting his daughter have these moments, these connections with people who'd cared for her when he couldn't. He'd changed so much in the past 2 months. The hardness that had defined him for decades had mellowed into something gentler, more present. He smiled more. He listened more. He'd even started volunteering in the hospital's family support group, talking with other parents whose children were facing medical mysteries, offering not solutions, but solidarity. When it was finally time to go, when all the paperwork had been signed and all the goodbyes had been said, Lucy turned to the small crowd of nurses and staff who'd gathered in her room and made a simple request. I'd like Rosa to walk me out, she said. if that's okay. Rosa felt her eyes burn with tears for what felt like the 100th time since this whole journey had begun. She stepped forward, and Lucy linked her arm through Rosa's, leaning on her slightly, not because she needed the physical support anymore, but because she wanted the connection. They walked together down the hallway, past the nurse's station where Rosa had spent so many nights watching security footage and documenting patterns in her spiral notebook. Past the stairwell where everything had come to a head on that stormy night. Past Lucy's former room, which already had a new patient, a new family, a new set of mysteries to solve. The elevator ride down was quiet, companionable. Lucy's hand rested on Rosa's arm, and Rosa could feel the strength in that grip, the life that had almost been stolen but had fought its way back. In the hospital lobby, with its perpetual smell of antiseptic and its outdated magazines, and its families waiting for news about their loved ones, Lucy stopped. She turned to face Rosa fully, taking both of her hands. 50 doctors examined me, Lucy said, her voice clear and strong. Specialists with decades of experience, with prestigious degrees, with reputations that made people travel across the country for their expertise. And not one of them saw what you saw. Not one of them questioned what should have been questioned. You saved my life, Rosa. Not with some revolutionary treatment or some brilliant diagnosis. You saved me by paying attention, by caring enough to look when it would have been so much easier to accept what everyone else was accepting. Rosa opened her mouth to respond, but Lucy squeezed her hands gently. I'm going to grad school, Lucy continued. I'm going to study public health, and I'm going to spend my career working on patient safety protocols, on systems that catch the things that slip through the cracks. And every single day, I'm going to remember that I'm only alive to do that work because one nurse refused to look away. Thank you, Rosa, for everything. They hugged then, a long embrace that carried the weight of everything they'd been through together. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were crying, but they were the good kind of tears. The kind that came from gratitude and hope and the profound relief of a story that could have ended in tragedy, but didn't. Admiral Hartwell waited by the lobby doors, giving them space, but Rosa could see him watching. There was a small smile on his weathered face, the kind of expression that spoke of peace hard-won, of a father who'd come so close to losing everything and now got to watch his daughter walk out into sunlight and future and possibility. Rosa walked Lucy to the entrance, where the Admiral took over, his arm around his daughter's shoulders as they headed toward the parking lot. Lucy turned back once, waving, and Rosa waved back, standing in that lobby long after they'd disappeared from view, feeling the enormousness of what had transpired in this building over the past few months. But the story didn't end there. Admiral James Hartwell had never been a man who did things halfway, and saving his daughter had ignited something in him that wouldn't be satisfied with just one scholarship, just one nurse helped. 3 weeks after Lucy's discharge, he contacted Clearwater Memorial's administration with a proposal. He wanted to fund a comprehensive training program in Rosa's name, the Rosa Delgado Patient Safety Initiative. It would focus specifically on night shift nurses, the ones who worked when supervisors were gone home, when the hospital ran on skeleton crews, when the small observations and quiet suspicions were easiest to dismiss or ignore. The program would train nurses to recognize subtle signs of patient interference, to trust their clinical instincts, to document patterns that didn't fit standard presentations, and to navigate the complex dynamics of questioning more experienced providers or trusted family members. The hospital administration agreed immediately. The Admiral's donation was substantial enough to fund not just the initial program, but its expansion and sustainability for years to come. They brought in experts in patient safety, in toxicology, in the psychology of medical harm. They developed case studies, including Lucy's story with the family's permission, teaching tools that would help nurses recognize the warning signs Rosa had noticed. The first cohort of nurses went through the training 4 months after Lucy's discharge. 20 night shift nurses from Clearwater Memorial, spending 4 intensive weeks learning to sharpen their observational skills, to question assumptions, to be advocates for patients even when it made them uncomfortable. Rosa, who was deep into her critical care program by then, came back to speak to them. She stood in front of her colleagues, many of whom she'd worked alongside for years, and told them about the bitter smell, the door sensor click, the vital sign patterns. She told them about being terrified she was wrong, about risking her reputation and her job, about following her instincts into that dark stairwell. The technology didn't save Lucy, Rosa told them. The monitors and the tests and the imaging equipment all said she was fine. What saved her was attention. Human attention. A willingness to trust what I was observing even when it contradicted everything the data was telling me. That's what this program is about. Teaching you to be the person who looks when everyone else has stopped looking. The program worked. Within 6 months, nurses who'd completed the Rosa Delgado training had identified 3 cases of family members tampering with patient care. None as severe as Lucy's case, but all potentially dangerous. All situations that would have continued undetected without nurses who'd been trained to notice the subtle signs. Word spread. Other hospitals wanted the program. The Admiral, true to his nature, didn't keep it proprietary or exclusive. He funded its expansion. By the end of the first year, the Rosa Delgado Patient Safety Initiative was being implemented in hospitals across 3 states: Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana. Hundreds of night shift nurses learning to trust their instincts, to document their observations, to be advocates for patients who couldn't advocate for themselves. The program saved lives. Not dramatically, not with headlines or fanfare, but quietly, consistently, the way Rosa had saved Lucy. One observation at a time. One pattern noticed. One nurse refusing to accept normal when their patient was clearly suffering. Medical journals published papers about the initiative. Patient safety conferences invited Rosa and the Admiral to speak. The program became a model for how hospitals could empower their nursing staff, particularly those working off hours when oversight was minimal. It grew beyond just detecting patient interference to encompass all kinds of subtle clinical observations that could prevent harm, catch errors, identify problems before they became crises. Rosa's one quiet act of vigilance, that decision to follow her instincts down a dark stairwell during a thunderstorm, had become a shield for countless others. Patients she would never meet, in hospitals she would never work in, were safer because she'd refused to look away from Lucy Hartwell. It started with a bitter smell, a suspicious click, and a nurse who refused to look away. It ended with lives saved, protocols changed, and proof that sometimes the most important medical tool isn't technology, it's attention. Now, let me tell you where they are today, because every story about justice deserves to know its ending reached beyond just one moment, one rescue, one life saved. Rosa Delgado graduated at the top of her critical care program 18 months after Lucy's discharge. She had multiple job offers before she even finished her final clinical rotation. She chose a position at a Level 1 trauma center in Houston, where she works in the intensive care unit, handling the most complex patients, the cases that require not just technical skill, but the kind of clinical intuition that can't be taught, only developed. She's 29 now, recently engaged, still carrying that spiral notebook in her scrubs pocket, still trusting her observations over the printouts. She mentors new nurses, teaching them what the Admiral taught her, that the greatest gift you can give someone isn't answers, but opportunity. Lucy Hartwell completed her graduate school applications from her childhood bedroom, her strength fully returned, her weight healthy, her future bright. She was accepted to Stanford's public health program, the same one she'd been planning to attend before Marcus's poisoning had derailed everything. She starts this fall, and her focus area is patient safety systems, specifically how to create protocols that catch the kinds of subtle harm that traditional medical oversight misses. She's writing her thesis on family-perpetrated medical abuse, using her own case as the foundation. She wants to change how hospitals screen for and respond to patient interference, how they train staff to recognize warning signs, how they protect vulnerable patients from the people who are supposed to love them most. Marcus Brennan pled guilty to attempted murder and aggravated assault. He was sentenced to 8 years in state prison, eligible for parole after 5. During his sentencing hearing, he apologized to Lucy and the Admiral, his voice breaking as he tried to explain the desperation and fear that had driven him to poison someone he genuinely cared about. The judge was unmoved. "You had medical training," the judge said. "You knew exactly what you were doing, and you did it anyway, night after night, watching her suffer, watching her father's anguish, and you never stopped. 8 years is a mercy you didn't extend to your victim." Marcus is currently incarcerated at a medium-security facility outside Austin. The Admiral has not visited him. Lucy has not visited him. They've both moved forward, choosing to invest their energy in healing and purpose rather than anger and regret. Admiral James Hartwell retired from active duty 6 months after Lucy's discharge. He'd spent 30 years in the Navy, but nearly losing his daughter had rearranged his priorities in ways that couldn't be undone. He moved to a smaller house in Clearwater, close enough to the hospital to continue his volunteer work with the family support group, close enough to visit Lucy when she comes home from California on breaks. He's gentler now, slower to judge, quicker to listen. He funded the Rosa Delgado initiative with his retirement savings, and he says it's the best investment he's ever made. He keeps in touch with Rosa, calling her every few months to check in, to hear about her cases, to remind her that she changed his life as much as she changed Lucy's. This story is a reminder that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like someone who cares too much, in all the wrong ways. Marcus Brennan loved the Admiral. He was grateful for the second chance he'd been given. But his need to be needed, his terror of losing his place in the family, twisted that love into something toxic, something deadly. He didn't set out to kill Lucy. He just couldn't let her leave. And in trying to keep her close, he nearly destroyed her completely. If this story moved you, hit that like button. If you know a nurse who goes above and beyond, someone who pays attention when others look away, someone who advocates for their patients even when it's uncomfortable or risky, share this video with them. Let them know they're appreciated, that their vigilance matters, that their refusal to accept normal when something feels wrong could be the difference between life and death for someone's daughter, someone's mother, someone's child. And if you believe in justice, real justice, the kind that comes not from revenge, but from making sure the same harm doesn't happen to someone else, subscribe to this channel. Because we tell stories about ordinary people who do extraordinary things when it matters most. We tell stories about night shift nurses with student debt and spiral notebooks who save lives. We tell stories about fathers who learn humility through nearly losing what matters most. We tell stories about patients who survive because someone cared enough to look. Thank you for watching Lucy and Rosa's story. Thank you for spending this hour with us, for investing your attention in a tale about the power of paying attention. And remember, as you go back to your own lives, your own work, your own relationships, pay attention. The smallest details can save a life. The bitter smell that doesn't belong. The pattern that doesn't make sense. The instinct that something is wrong even when all the data says everything is fine. Trust those observations. Document them. Pursue them. You might be the only person who notices. You might be the only person who cares enough to look. And that might make all the difference.